Imagine this. You wake up one morning and nothing in your life has changed. Same room, same body, same responsibilities, but something feels subtly wrong, or perhaps more unsettling. Something feels too familiar. You move through the day on autopilot, speaking the same phrases, thinking the same thoughts, reacting with the same emotions, and then it hits you with quiet force. Before you even chose how to feel today, the words were already there, waiting, ready to decide for you. You tell yourself, "I'm not a morning person." You mutter, "This is just how I am." You joke, "Life is hard." Each sentence slips out effortlessly, harmlessly, just words, just sounds. And yet, notice what happens next. Your body tightens, your mood narrows, your expectations shrink. Without realizing it, you begin to behave in ways that make those words come true. Here's the paradox that almost no one confronts. You believe you use words to describe reality, but what if words are quietly creating it? If that idea makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it suggests something deeply unsettling. That much of what you call your personality, your limitations, even your suffering may not be fixed traits or inevitable facts, but linguistic habits you've mistaken for truth. Think about it. Before fear arises, there is a sentence. Before shame takes hold, there is a label. Before you give up, there is a story you tell yourself about why trying is pointless. You don't just experience life, you narrate it. Constantly. And that narration doesn't merely interpret events after they happen, it shapes how you perceive them while they are unfolding. What you call reality may be nothing more than a well-rehearsed script. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If you removed the words you habitually use to describe your life, who would you be underneath them? Without failure, without success, without not good enough, without too late? Would the emotional weight still be there, or does it exist only because language keeps reactivating it? You were taught that words are neutral tools, that they simply point to things that already exist. A chair is a chair. A problem is a problem. You are who you are. But notice how fragile that assumption is. Call a challenge an opportunity, and your nervous system responds differently. Call yourself broken, and your posture changes. Call someone an enemy, and violence suddenly feels reasonable. Words don't just describe meaning, they carry it. They smuggle judgments, values, and emotional charges directly into your mind, often without your consent. And the most dangerous words are not the dramatic ones, not insults or slurs or explicit beliefs. The most dangerous words are the quiet, repetitive ones you never question, the phrases you inherited, the metaphors you live inside without noticing, the inner monologue that runs so constantly you confuse it with your own voice. This is just reality. That's how the world works. People like me don't get that. Who taught you those sentences? And more importantly, why do you trust them? You might think your thoughts are private, harmless, inconsequential, but words shape perception, and perception shapes action. Action shapes habit. Habit shapes identity. Identity shapes destiny. By the time you feel stuck, the prison has already been built, brick by brick, sentence by sentence. And here's the unsettling twist. The world benefits when you never question this. A person who believes the labels given to them is predictable, controllable, easy to manage. If you define yourself as anxious, you will seek comfort, not transformation. If you define yourself as realistic, you will avoid risk and call it wisdom. If you define yourself as powerless, you will obey while calling it acceptance. So ask yourself, are your words serving you, or are you serving them? There is a reason revolutions always begin with new language. A reason every ideology fights first over definitions, a reason why those in power obsess over narratives, slogans, and frames. Control the words, and you don't need chains. People will limit themselves willingly, believing it was their idea all along. And the most disturbing part? You may be doing this to yourself. Right now, as you read this, your mind is already trying to categorize, agree, disagree, dismiss, or intellectualize. Even that is language at work, trying to regain control, to restore the familiar order, because questioning words means questioning reality itself, and that threatens the fragile sense of certainty you've built your life upon. But if words have the power to confine you, what happens when that power is reversed? What lies beyond the stories you've been repeating? What kind of life becomes possible when language no longer runs unconsciously in the background, but becomes something you can see, challenge, and reshape? To answer that, you must first understand why words have this power at all, where it comes from, how it took root in the human psyche, and why modern society depends on you never noticing it. That is where the real danger and the real awakening begins. The power of words over your reality did not appear by accident. It is not a modern glitch, not merely a side effect of social media or advertising or politics. It is rooted far deeper, woven into the architecture of the human psyche itself. To understand why words govern you so effortlessly, you must confront an uncomfortable truth. The human mind does not experience reality directly. It experiences symbols. Long before you learn to analyze or reason, you learned to name. And in naming, you learned to separate. This is a tree. That is danger. This is me. That is not me. Language carved the world into manageable pieces, allowing consciousness to survive, but at a cost. What began as a survival tool slowly became a filter, then a cage. Carl Jung understood this well. He argued that consciousness is built on symbols and archetypes, shared mental structures that give form to otherwise chaotic experience. Words latch onto these archetypes, activating deep emotional patterns without you ever realizing it. When you say failure, you are not referring to a neutral event. You are invoking an entire psychic constellation: shame, rejection, inadequacy, fear of exclusion. The word summons a myth inside you, and you react as if that myth were real. This is why words feel heavier than facts. You can objectively succeed and still feel like a failure. You can be safe and still feel threatened. Your nervous system responds not to reality as it is, but to reality as it has been named. Language bypasses logic and speaks directly to the unconscious. Nietzsche took this insight further and darker. He believed language was never neutral, never innocent. Words, in his view, are expressions of power. Whoever defines the terms defines what is considered normal, moral, possible. Over time, these definitions harden into what he called truths, even though they are merely old metaphors that have been forgotten as metaphors. Think about how casually you say things like, time is money, life is a struggle, or you have to be realistic. These are not facts. They are philosophical positions disguised as common sense, and once internalized, they quietly dictate how you live. Arthur Schopenhauer saw language as a double-edged sword. It allows abstraction, reflection, and meaning, but it also traps humans in endless mental representation. You don't just feel pain, you think about pain. You don't just desire, you narrate desire. This constant verbalization amplifies suffering. The mind loops, repeats, dramatizes. A moment of discomfort becomes a story about your entire life. Words don't let experiences pass. They make them stick. Modern psychology confirms what these philosophers intuited. Cognitive science shows that the brain uses language to predict reality. Labels become shortcuts. Once something is named, the brain stops exploring it. It assumes it already knows. Call yourself anxious, and every bodily sensation is interpreted through that lens. Call a situation threatening, and your fight-or-flight response activates before conscious thought can intervene. This is not weakness, it is efficiency. The brain evolved to conserve energy, not seek truth. Language helps it do that, by turning complex reality into simplified narratives. But efficiency comes at a price: rigidity. Jean-Paul Sartre warned that humans often use language to escape responsibility. By saying, "That's just how I am," or "I had no choice," you transform living, fluid freedom into a static identity. Words become excuses masquerading as descriptions. Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to yourself by pretending your labels are destiny. And society reinforces this at every level. From childhood, you are named before you are known. Smart, difficult, gifted, problematic. These words don't just describe behavior, they sculpt identity. Over time, you begin to perform them, not consciously, but compulsively. The label becomes a role, and the role becomes a personality. Aldous Huxley saw where this leads on a cultural scale. In a world saturated with language, slogans, headlines, diagnoses, metrics, people stop experiencing life directly. They consume interpretations instead. Reality is prepackaged, pre-labeled, pre-digested, and the more language mediates experience, the less raw, immediate, and alive it feels. This is the hidden problem. Words were meant to serve life, but life is now serving words. You don't ask what you feel, you ask what it means. You don't ask what you want, you ask what makes sense. You don't ask who you are becoming, you ask which category you fit into. Language replaces presence. Labels replace curiosity. Narratives replace truth. Viktor Frankl observed something crucial in extreme conditions. People who survived were not those with the most comfort or strength, but those who could find meaning beyond circumstance. Yet meaning itself is a linguistic construct. This reveals the paradox. Words can imprison you, or they can save you. The difference lies in whether they are unconscious or chosen. But most people never choose. They inherit language the way they inherit gravity, assuming it is simply how things are. They mistake descriptions for limits, stories for laws, and slowly, silently, the world narrows. Possibility shrinks. The future feels predetermined. Yet beneath this linguistic web, something restless remains. A vague sense that life is more than the words used to describe it. A quiet frustration. A tension you can't quite name, because naming it would require stepping outside the language that created it, and that tension is growing. Because the deeper consequence of living inside borrowed words is not just confusion or limitation, it is disconnection from instinct, from intuition, from reality as it is before it is interpreted. The more you live through language alone, the more artificial your experience becomes. What happens when an entire society lives this way? What happens when words no longer point to reality but replace it? That is where the unseen consequences begin to unfold, subtly at first, then everywhere at once. When words quietly take control of reality, the damage is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment where everything collapses. Instead, something far more dangerous happens. Life becomes thinner, flatter, less alive. And because this erosion is gradual, most people never realize what they've lost. You begin to live inside interpretations instead of experiences. Consider how rarely you encounter the world without immediately translating it into language. A sensation arises. tightness in the chest, and instantly it becomes anxiety. A wave of sadness appears, and it is labeled weakness or depression. A moment of boredom surfaces, and it is diagnosed as a lack of motivation. The label arrives so quickly that the raw experience never gets a chance to speak for itself. This is not harmless. Neuroscience shows that naming an emotion does not merely describe it, it changes how the brain processes it. Language activates the prefrontal cortex, dampening or intensifying emotional circuits, depending on the label used. Call a sensation danger, and cortisol floods your system. Call it excitement, and dopamine follows. The body obeys the word, not the sensation. Over time, this creates a distorted feedback loop. You stop trusting your direct experience and start trusting the story about it. Reality becomes secondhand. Cognitive biases thrive in this environment. Confirmation bias ensures you notice only what fits the words you already believe. If you call yourself unlucky, every setback becomes proof. If you believe people can't be trusted, ambiguity is interpreted as betrayal. Language narrows perception, and narrowed perception reinforces language. The loop closes, and because the brain craves coherence more than truth, it prefers a flawed story to an open question. On a personal level, this produces quiet suffering. You feel trapped but can't explain why. You feel restless even when nothing is wrong. You feel exhausted by life itself, not because life is unbearable, but because constantly narrating it is. Every action must be justified. Every feeling must be explained. Every decision must align with an identity you've already defined in words. You are no longer living. You are managing a character. On a societal level, the consequences are even more severe. When entire cultures operate through rigid language, complexity disappears. Nuance dies. People stop seeing each other as fluid, contradictory beings and start seeing labels instead. Ally, enemy, victim, oppressor, success, failure. Once a word replaces a human, empathy collapses. History shows this pattern relentlessly. Before violence becomes acceptable, language changes first. People become threats, parasites, problems, statistics. The moral weight dissolves the moment a word erases individuality. At that point, cruelty feels logical, necessary, even righteous. Modern society may believe it has outgrown this tendency, but it has merely refined it. Today, words don't just describe people, they diagnose them, brand them, market them. Identities are compressed into bios, metrics, categories, and once named they are expected to perform consistently. You feel this pressure every day to be confident, to be productive, to be authentic. Each word carries an invisible standard, and failing to meet it feels like a personal flaw, even when the standard itself is incoherent. This creates a population that is deeply anxious, yet unable to articulate why. Because the language available to them is already part of the problem. There is also a neurological cost. Constant verbalization keeps the brain in a state of low-level vigilance. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels threatening. Without words, many people feel as if they disappear. So they fill every gap with noise, content, commentary, self-talk, not realizing that the exhaustion they feel is not from doing too much, but from thinking in words without pause. The result is a peculiar modern condition. People are overstimulated and underexperienced at the same time. They consume endless explanations about life, but feel increasingly disconnected from living it. They know the language of healing, growth, and awareness, yet feel stuck in the same patterns, because knowing the right words is not the same as escaping their unconscious grip. This is why even insight can become another trap. You can intellectually understand your trauma and still live inside its vocabulary. You can analyze your patterns endlessly while never stepping outside the narrative that sustains them. Awareness, when it remains purely linguistic, becomes a sophisticated form of stagnation. And here is the most dangerous consequence of all. When words define reality, imagination dies. Possibility requires ambiguity. Transformation requires not knowing who you are yet. But language rushes to close the gap, to name, to stabilize. The moment something is labeled, it becomes predictable, manageable, less alive. This is why many people secretly fear change, not because it is painful, but because it threatens the words that hold their identity together. So they cling to familiar suffering rather than step into unnamed territory. The tragedy is not that words have power. The tragedy is that this power remains invisible. You don't feel controlled. You feel reasonable, logical, informed. That is how the trap maintains itself. But cracks are forming. You sense them when the old explanations stop working, when advice feels hollow, when motivation fades despite understanding what should be done, when the language that once guided you now feels heavy, insufficient, even false. That discomfort is not a failure, it is a signal. It means the words you've been living inside can no longer contain the complexity of who you are becoming. And that realization, if followed rather than avoided, marks the beginning of rebellion, not against society, not against others, but against the silent tyranny of unconscious language itself. What happens when you stop believing every word you think? What happens when you no longer let language define the limits of experience? The answer does not come from better descriptions. It comes from a radical shift in how you relate to words altogether.